Welcome to the Daily MBA, where business wisdom is served fresh and fast, straight from one of the top MBA programs in the world. I'll give you summaries of my lectures and readings, as well as the most important insights gained from an MBA, so you can apply all of this knowledge in every business. Let's get started. On today's episode, I have a very special guest because he was my professor. It's Adrian, and he's the author of the Visa Africa Integration Index and the Investec GIBS Savings Index, two pivotal studies that offer deep insights into the economic connectivity and financial health of African countries. But his experience also goes across the globe, from Brazil to Singapore, where he has a profound understanding of the complexities of emerging markets. In addition to all of these academic achievements, Adrian has also an impressive entrepreneurial track record. He established and grew an investment firm that was successfully sold in 2017, and most recently, he launched Shore Consulting, an advisory firm focusing on capital markets, business model innovation, and growth strategy. So, Adrian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Maria. Great to be with you.
So, for starting today, I wanted to go to the basics and know what is the definition of an emerging market to you?
An emerging market tends to be characterized by a couple of attributes. First, you get a clue from the term emerging that the country is progressing or advancing. And by a textbook definition, an emerging market would be growing quicker than most others, and certainly quicker than the world average. So that would be in terms of economic growth, that would be the first attribute. The second is that emerging markets are typically coming off a very low base, usually measured by per person income. In other words, these are low income or poor countries that are growing quickly off very low bases, and in that way they are developing. And the development would be measured by reductions in poverty, falling unemployment, rising income per person, improvements in broad living standards, rising life expectancy, and so on. Those would be the attributes of emerging markets. But no sooner have we given a definition of an emerging market or those descriptors of an emerging market, then we quickly realize that emerging markets are extremely different. Philippines, Bangladesh, Lebanon, to go to a country that's grabbing a lot of headline attention. So whilst they have common attributes, they're extremely different when we single them out for attention.
Okay, perfect. And that gives us like a basis for starting to look at emerging markets. And I'm also going to switch to some frameworks because during our course, we learned some frameworks that you gave to us for analyzing emerging markets. And the first one of those was the 6-factor model. And so the 6 factors are savings and investments, demography, policy and institutions, education, health, and openness. So can you walk us a little bit through the 6 factors and maybe tell us which one do you think is the most important one for an emerging market?
Well, that's such a lovely question. Perhaps first it's worth giving a tiny bit of context to why the 6-factor model matters so much. Is, as I've hinted in describing emerging markets, that they range from the Philippines to Vietnam to Venezuela. They're extremely different and diverse. That's the first point of reference in applying the 6-factor model. And because these economies are so different and diverse, it's helpful to have a common set of tools that you can apply to develop an understanding of the structural growth prospects of each of these countries. And that's where the 6-factor model comes to power. The way in which we established the model is the research started about 15 years ago. We use a very big data pool, 160 countries, 60 years of data, 1,200 line items of data per country. So this is a massive data lake for people interested in economic development and the emergence of markets. And we ask the data a simple but I think elegant question. And the simple but elegant question is, are there ingredients that are common to countries that have transitioned and transformed? And we measure country transition and transformation by a movement from being a poor, low-income country to a high-income country with advances or elevated human development indices. So that's the evidence that the country has transitioned. And then we go and ask for what are the common ingredients. And I'm not sure how many times I've sort of told the story around the model or spoken to the model thousands of times, but I'm continually delighted by the emergence of just 6 factors that are common to countries that transition. You've mentioned them, that they're worth elaborating just a tiny bit on each of them.
Yeah.
So the first of the 6 factors is savings and investment. And this points to the fact that in order for a country to grow, it needs investment. And investment is measured by gross domestic fixed investment, highways, harbors, hospitals, and so on, fiber optic cable. You need elevated gross domestic fixed investment, and elevated is above the world average. In other words, about a quarter of GDP or higher. In order to fund that investment, you need savings, and that's the savings investment cocktail. So that's the first ingredient. And, the spoiler is in being the first ingredient, it's also the most important. It probably explains across countries about 1/4 to 1/3 of economic growth, just that single component. There's an important way of putting this counterfactually, and the counterfactual goes like this, that there is no country in all of our data that has been able to transition without elevated investment and saving. It is an absolutely critical factor. The second ingredient is demography, and to put this simply, babies drive economic development because babies are tomorrow's workforce. And if there are any economists listening in on the podcast, you can think of this as the Solow growth model, named after Robert Solow, that the productive side of an economy really has 2 components, people and productivity. And babies born today are part of the 20 years' time workforce and productive engine. So it measured by population growth lags economic growth by 20 years, but it's a critical ingredient. We know also that countries that run out of babies, I hope that expression travels well, but countries that run out of babies struggle to sustain economic advance. Japan, South Korea, Italy, Russia are cases in point where their demographic pyramid has inverted. If you have babies, that in and of itself isn't enough. The babies need capability, and that capability comes from education and healthcare, which are ingredients 3 and 4. Importantly, healthcare is a leading indicator over education. Put simply, you can't educate a workforce that isn't healthy. And also importantly, the way in which we measure health or healthcare is not just by physical health, life expectancy, infant mortality, but also by social and psychological health. That is the social and psychological fabric of the society strong, that there is a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. And I think this adds a very valuable dimension to understanding the economies that we describe as emerging, because it explicitly acknowledges that it's not just about improving per person incomes. And then the 5th ingredient is policies and institutions. To my absolute delight, when we established the findings of this work initially, we learn that it is policy stability rather than the policy itself. That's such a powerful piece of data because it removes a whole lot of frustration and confusion about what is the best policy. It just says, I suppose like parenting is my bad example. No one has perfected parenting. We've all been kids, and we know that, as kids, we try and find the edges of the envelope. The guide to parents is set the parameters and the framework and then hold that framework. That's the clue about policies. And then institutions are the institutions that are capable of implementing those policies. And then the 6th ingredient is openness. no country has become or has developed, transformed by building walls and locking itself away from the rest of the world. That doesn't mean opening up in and of itself is a magic ingredient, because we can find lots of examples of dysfunctional openness. The transatlantic slave trade, colonization, war are all horrific examples. So what we're looking for in that sixth ingredient of openness is win-win outcomes. Those 6 ingredients put together give you a very powerful clue about the economic and social advanced prospects or development prospects of a country. That's the 6-factor model. Long answer, but this is my baby.
No, but it's a great overview of this model, and that's why I wanted to go deeper into this one, because I think it explains a lot about emerging markets as a whole. And it's something that also I've seen in like Latin America. The more investment countries have in infrastructure, education, all of those things is going to drive to potentially like getting better output per person and productivity levels. And I also wanted to go into another model that I really liked that you presented, and it's a bit related to this last piece of openness, and it's the TCIP framework. So this letters stand for Trade, Capital, Information, and People, and it was a measure that you were explaining about connectedness. So can you also walk us through this model and explain why these are key concepts for an emerging market?
Let me just say, 1 minute very quickly about why I think the 6-factor model is so useful. Mm-hmm. And more than to economists, to non-economists, to people who are interested in doing business, who are interested in building families in different countries, is if we pick up this lens and we apply it to Latin America, your home, the 6-factor model quickly tells us that it doesn't really matter what policymakers say in Venezuela. Venezuela sits with a 0 or negative growth structure. That Argentina, whilst it's going through spectacular policy transition, actually has a structural growth model of about 1 or 1.5%. That Colombia sits with a more elevated growth structure. So you can quickly get a almost expert eye on the differences or idiosyncrasies in at the country level by applying this 6-factor model. To go to the TCIP component, when I made reference to the 6th ingredient, openness, my suggestion was that openness needs to be functional win-win type openness, that by you and I connecting, we may not gain equally, but we are both better off through our connection. And that's the purpose or the intent of the TCIP model, is to establish that your connections with other countries are functional, that they are integrative, that they're going to help advance industrial competitiveness, economic performance, incomes per person, and so on. And to my surprise, very often when policymakers, politicians, economists talk about country connectedness, they generally refer to just 2 of the ways in which countries connect. They generally refer to trade and capital. And trade is the exchange of goods, the exchange of services, and capital is foreign aid, foreign investment, international loans. So those are the trade and capital, the T and the C components. They matter substantially for countries' connectedness. But the I and the P components from our work matter even more. And I and P are information and people. And this references, information references exchange of data, knowledge, know-how, know-why, the movement of ideas. And people references everything from tourists to students to refugees and to immigrants. This is the form or the way in which people can go across borders. This TCIP model is a very powerful way of measuring not only the extent to which a country is connected to others, but the way in which that country is connected. And then, if we take, I'm speaking to you from South Africa, so I'll give you one of our notorious neighbors, Angola, which is notorious in my reference here, because of the fact that it connects across borders essentially really only with tea, with trade. Not much capital goes across borders, relatively little information, and it's very difficult for people to get in and out of Angola. Not impossible, just hard. It's what we would call a relatively closed economy. So its connection then is chiefly through the trade channel, tea. And then when we interrogate that trade channel, this sounds like a made-up number. It's not. 99% of Angola's exports is oil, and that export goes to 3 countries. So, this TCIP gives you big clues about the ways in which countries connect, who they connected to, how they connected to, and if those connections are becoming increasingly intertwined, and if those connections are functional.
Okay. And I want to ask you just a follow-up question on that, because I wanted to know, in Africa, you were saying, like, especially Angola, it's a very closed market. But do you see any other big, like, barriers that can be, like, generalized either in Southern Africa or Western African markets? And how can they be overcome for, like, businesses that want to work there?
That's a core part of the work that we do. You referenced in the introduction our advisory business, and we're involved with companies, helping them think about why they go across borders. In other words, the purpose and the intent of internationalization, and then how they go across borders. Is it licensing, franchises, JVs, foreign direct investment, trade, etc.? And then where they go to, which countries they go to. So, the question that you're asking here is absolutely central to the work that we do. And if you think of, Africa in the aggregate, everywhere in Africa was colonized with the exception of Ethiopia. And overwhelmingly, the colonization was set up with the intent of extraction. So the wave of independence swept through Africa. In the 1950s, 1960s, countries achieved independence. But whilst they achieved political independence, they didn't achieve economic independence. And it remains the case that, broadly speaking, Africa in the aggregate, infrastructure is set up to be extractive. It is set up to get things out of Africa, and it isn't set up to connect African economies to each other. And so this continues to represent, 60 years on, represents a material headwind to doing business in Africa. There are countries or regions that are squaring up to this and reversing that legacy. The East African community is probably the rock star of this advance or redress, including the likes of Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, making big strides, not only in connecting with the rest of the world, but connecting with each other. And I would venture that the East African community, in the foreseeable future, I'm not quite sure how long the foreseeable future is, but in the foreseeable future, the East African community becomes borderless, it becomes single passport and possibly even single currency. So, there are some fantastic examples of reversing out of this legacy. And, in that breath, I would also, urge anyone who's listening in on this and interested in Africa in the aggregate, explicitly recognizes that Africa isn't a place, that we've got, Angola that exports oil with massive income inequality. And then we've got Kenya that exports agricultural product and imports oil and is becoming a seedbed of fintech, a vibrant technology and financial services hub. So in a sentence, Africa isn't a place. And then, just very briefly, you haven't mentioned it, but if I could take the liberty of dropping in a third model, it's called the CAGE model.
Yes.
And you and I have spoken about this in our classroom time. The CAGE model refers to culture, administration, geography, economics. And wherever you're going across border, so we borrow this work from Pankaj Gemawat from New York Stern University. And the CAGE framework says when you're going across border, think about these 4 things: your cultural similarity or cultural distance, administrative similarity or distance? Do I understand your laws, your courts, your legal system, your contracting system? Do I understand what happens when I fill in my tax forms and customs because I've got a similar system? Geography says, generally speaking, it helps that we are in similar time zones and geographically proximate. And then economics says that your economy has an appetite for the things that I produce. So it's another really useful way of thinking about who we connect with when we've satisfied ourselves that we've got something is internationalizable.
Okay. Yeah, that's very, very good point, because I wanted to bring the cage model as well, and especially when we're talking about internationalization. And I want to ask, like, since you've studied this huge databases of information and across countries, like, what is usually the biggest challenge companies face when they are internationalizing into emerging markets?
Yeah, what a great question. Almost invariably, the cage model explains the challenges that they run into. And of the four elements of the cage model, it's culture that is typically the largest barrier. And culture is usually, when you say culture, people get sort of prickly. They're like, oh, hang on, are you about to suggest that my culture is bad and your culture is good? That is absolutely not the point about the C of culture in the cage framework. Your culture is your culture. My culture is mine. And if we are culturally similar or proximate, it is likely that we will be more successful in business together. And the way in which culture can be measured is around norms, values, beliefs, religious systems, hierarchical structures. If your society is short-term in its outlook or more longer-term. And for this reason, it is typically the case, not always, but it is typically the case, countries that speak the same language very often connect most easily when it comes to doing business, because if we speak the same language, there's an extremely good chance that we have the same religious system. There is also, because of colonization, an extremely good chance that we have the same legal systems and the same administrative systems. You're Latin American, you get this. And, if you go to Brazil, you know that going from Argentina to Brazil is far more difficult than going from Argentina to Peru because of the Portuguese versus Spanish. Mm-hmm. In my context, if I go from South Africa to Angola, it's a very, very far way away because Angola was colonized by the Portuguese. And so Angola is Lusophone. It has got Portuguese legal system. They speak Portuguese, Portuguese cultures, behaviors, beliefs. If I go from South Africa to Zimbabwe or Zambia, we were all colonized by the British. So we've been through the same education system. We can all make jokes about British politicians. We are all probably Christian in our religious background, and so on. So this cage component is arguably, no, more than arguably, if we take the evidence of countries that have companies that have internationalized, the countries that they tend to go to with greatest success are countries with close culturally. Not always, not everywhere. Of course, there are many, many exceptions, but that's a starting point in thinking about where you go in your internationalization.
Okay, great. And I'm assuming that this model works for like any type of internationalization. Like even if we take a company that started in emerging markets and now is trying to move into advanced markets. But I wanted to know if there are any nuances over there. So for example, a South African company that might want to go to UK, like there's a little bit of a cultural similar, let's say, over there. But then the difference would be that they're now going into a very developed economy. So is there any other like difference that you might see when the internationalization is going the other way around from emerging markets into developed economies?
increasingly companies are internationalizing from emerging markets. And we've seen some really successful examples. Historically, Embraer would be, a great case in point, from Latin America, from South Africa, from Africa. MTN would be a really good case in point. Most often, emerging market companies internationalize to other emerging markets before they try and internationalize to advanced markets. But, your point is well made that there is a growing representation of companies that are internationalizing from emerging markets to advanced markets. Good examples that spring to mind here would be Alibaba from China, Huawei, Xiaomi, all three of those great Chinese examples. Internationalizing from emerging markets, Indian motor firms are making significant strides. And it tends to be the case that they generally find points of entry that resonate with their home market. So it may not be producing luxury cars for your home market that you now go and produce luxury cars for the UK. Rather, it's producing, rugged utility vehicles in South Africa that you can now go and export rugged utility vehicles to UK farmers and agricultural businesses. So it's finding your unique positioning in those host countries. And that really is that really hinges on you as a business understanding your core capability and the essence of your competitive advantage. And if you are competitive at home, will you be competitive in another market? And that's an issue that demands attention. It's very easy to be seduced by the fact that you've been successful at home for a decade, 2 decades, therefore we will be successful somewhere else. You want to stress test this assumption fiercely before you jump into foreign waters.
Okay. And kind of related to that, we looked a little bit of things around innovation in our class, because the successful companies, let's say, that have been able to move from emerging markets into advanced economies are those that are doing, let's say, a reverse innovation. So they're bringing something that's more valuable into this developed economies. So I wanted to ask you, if across all of the countries that you've been studying, you've seen that there are factors related to innovation in specific emerging markets, and which would be those factors?
So I think the innovation that travels most obviously is what I would refer to as frugal innovation. And this is about being able to do a lot with little. And, almost by definition, if you are an advanced country, you have abundance. It's not that everyone has got everything they need, but per capita incomes are higher, governments have got bigger resources, education systems have got more rather than less, healthcare systems have got more rather than less. And if you're in an emerging market, you have to be able to do more with less. And that's the attribute of frugal innovation. And I'll give you two, great examples that really stand out in this instance. The first is a company that's gone from a very poor country and is providing world-class healthcare services to rich countries. And that company is called Narayana Health, which is an Indian heart hospital. And the founder of Narayana Health, Devi Shetty, is a world-leading heart surgeon. And he's got a calling to go back to India. He's working at Guy's Hospital. He's got a calling to go back to India to address this massive deficit of heart surgery and try and fill that void. And the problem is, even if he can take his advanced market brilliance into India, the price point at which he does heart surgery, $80,000 per person, just, there's no demand for that in India. Or there's a tiny demand, but, it's a fraction of a fraction. And so he works out how he can save and inject efficiencies and improve systems in every single possible facet of heart surgery. And he collapses the price of heart surgery by 90% with outcomes that are equivalent to Guy's hospital outcomes. And this is transformative in the case of Indian hospital heart. That model he picks up and he takes to the North American market. And that's a phenomenal illustration of how the circumstances in an emerging market force you to innovate, but that model is transportable. Not quite the same leap, but another similar but different example is Time Bank in South Africa. And Time Bank, TYME, it stands for Take Your Money Everywhere, has to build a banking structure that removes all possible costs out of banking. And the best way to do this is to build a virtual bank, a digital bank. And they do this against the backdrop of a well-established legacy banking system in South Africa, oligopoly banking system. 4 or 5 big banks dominate the industry, and they shave costs out of the banking system at every possible point. They can onboard a customer for as little as 60 US cents. This is one of the lowest costs of customer acquisition in the world, and it's born out of South Africa. Now they pick that model up and they've taken it not to the advanced world, not to the developed world. They've taken it to more developed economies. They've taken it to the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, which have more sophisticated economies and higher per person incomes in the aggregate than South Africa. So it's not quite the leap to a developed market. It's a leap to a bigger, faster growing, more sophisticated emerging market. But these are examples of how frugal innovation helps you leap from your home economy to another.
Awesome. Yeah, those 2 examples, when we read them in class, I loved them. They were so inspiring because it's also seeing how people are able to develop what you were saying, like a lot more with less. So I think kind of the bad circumstances are making you innovate.
You'll know the example of Nubank in Brazil, where Nubank, I think now has 100 million customers with a headcount of 6,000 people.
Yeah.
It's...
That's great. And so now my last question for wrapping it up, I want our listeners to stay with like one of the most important takeaways that will be related to growth. And so when we started our class, you were saying that we will be studying how to build a successful country, but that way you can also learn how to build a successful company. And then you presented some factors that could contribute to growth, but then you said that there were 2 very important ones. So I want you to share your opinions on what those growth factors are.
Sure. So those factors travel under the headlines of agility and absorption. And agility, really references the fact that you've got the ability to change, to adjust, to adapt, to go quicker, to go slower, that you've got optionality. Agility refers to the fact that you've got innovation in your business, that you've got the capacity to invent, reinvent, and that you will try lots of different things in different markets with different products. These are the attributes of agility. Agile businesses tend to be listening businesses and learning organizations. They also tend to be what we refer to as bottom-up businesses, that information comes from the bottom of the business and that information turns into knowledge, which informs strategy. And then absorptive businesses are businesses that are able to withstand disappointment, setback, misstepping, because every single company you and I know, that every single company in existence makes mistakes, missteps. But if you make a mistake and you misstep and you don't have the means to recover or withstand the setback, then those damages become permanent and your enterprise fails. So absorption is the ability to sort of take punches and blows and withstand setbacks and then recover. And here, I love reference to the term anti-fragile, where anti-fragile points to companies that when they experience a setback, it's not just that they can survive the setback, but that the business that you see after experiencing this is even stronger than the business before. And so these are the attributes of businesses that not just survive, but truly thrive in ever-changing environments, these attributes of agility and absorption.
Great. Thank you very much, Adrian. And thank you for coming. This conversation was amazing, and I'm sure listeners will enjoy it a lot.